Mexico and Canada are meeting without Trump, and this spells disaster for his trade war strategy. While Trump thought he could divide and conquer America's closest neighbors with his punishing tariffs, he may have just created his worst nightmare, a united front against him. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum and Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney met in Mexico City on Thursday, and what they're planning could fundamentally reshape North American trade without the United States. To understand why this meeting is such a catastrophe for Trump, we need to look at what led us here. Back in February, Trump launched what he called his most aggressive trade offensive yet, imposing 25% tariffs on virtually all imports from Canada and Mexico. His justification? The flow of fentanyl and illegal immigration. But here's the thing, this wasn't really about drugs or borders. This was Trump trying to use economic warfare to force his neighbors into submission. The tariffs hit both countries hard, but instead of capitulating, something unexpected happened. Canada, under its new Prime Minister Mark Carney, immediately retaliated with its own 25% tariffs on American goods worth over $20 billion. Mexico, led by President Sheinbaum, threatened similar measures. Trump had miscalculated badly. He thought he was dealing with the same weak leadership that had previously given in to his demands. But Mark Carney isn't Justin Trudeau. The former Bank of Canada governor and Bank of England chief came to power specifically promising to stand up to Trump's bullying tactics. In his victory speech after becoming Liberal Party leader, Carney didn't mince words about Trump's threats to make Canada the 51st state. That will never, ever happen. When asked about Trump's annexation comments, Carney responded in French, "C'est simple, c'est fou. It's simple. It's crazy." What's particularly telling is how Carney has been emphasizing Canada's strategy to diversify trade beyond the United States.
The U.S. president is a modern man. I speak with him regularly. We send each other text messages. But what's the most important right now for Canada is to diversify our trade internationally with Europe, in Asia, with Africa and South America. Thank you.
He's made it clear that while maintaining good relations with America is important, Canada cannot afford to be economically dependent on a partner that uses trade as a weapon. This represents a fundamental shift in Canadian foreign policy, one that prioritizes resilience over proximity. Trump's tariff strategy was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of economics and diplomacy. He assumed that because the United States is the largest economy in North America, Canada and Mexico would have no choice but to bend to his will. What he failed to recognize is that trade wars work both ways, and his neighbors weren't going to take his aggression lying down. The meeting between Carney and Sheinbaum represents the materialization of Trump's worst fears. For months, there had been speculation that Canada might try to cut a separate deal with the United States, potentially leaving Mexico isolated. Some Canadian politicians had even suggested exactly that, a bilateral agreement that would exclude Mexico entirely. But Trump's heavy-handed approach has pushed both countries into each other's arms. What makes this alliance particularly dangerous for Trump is the timing. The United States-Mexico-Canada agreement is up for review in 2026, and both leaders are now coordinating their approach to those negotiations. Instead of facing two separate countries that he could play against each other, Trump will now confront a unified bloc that represents America's two largest trading partners. The economic implications are staggering. Canada and Mexico together account for more than 30% of total U.S. trade. Mexico alone is America's largest trading partner, while Canada ranks second. The integrated nature of North American supply chains means that Trump's tariffs aren't just hurting foreign companies. They're devastating American businesses that depend on cross-border trade. Consider the automotive industry. The big three American automakers, Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis, have been lobbying desperately for exemptions from Trump's tariffs. Ford CEO Jim Farley warned investors that a 25% tariff across the Mexico and Canadian border will blow a hole in the U.S. industry that we have never seen. These aren't foreign competitors complaining. These are American companies that Trump's policies are destroying. But the Canada-Mexico alliance goes beyond just defensive measures. Both countries are actively working to diversify their trade relationships away from the United States. During their meeting, Carney and Sheinbaum discussed expanding bilateral trade, which was valued at over $40 billion in 2024. They're exploring new infrastructure projects, including ports and rail links that would facilitate trade between their countries and with other partners, notably excluding the United States from these plans. This represents a fundamental shift in North American geopolitics. For decades, both Canada and Mexico have been economically dependent on the United States, with trade flowing primarily north-south rather than east-west. Trump's aggressive tactics are forcing both countries to reconsider this arrangement and build alternative economic relationships. The irony is that Trump's stated goal was to bring manufacturing back to America and reduce trade deficits. Instead, his policies are pushing America's closest allies to find ways to trade around the United States entirely. Canada and Mexico are now working together to create supply chains that bypass American markets, potentially causing long-term damage to U.S. economic influence in the region. Trump's approach has also backfired diplomatically. His threats to annex Canada and rename the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America were intended to project strength and dominance. Instead, they've been received as the desperate bluster of a leader who doesn't understand how modern diplomacy works. International allies have taken notice. European Union leader Ursula von der Leyen quickly praised Carney's election victory, promising closer cooperation on trade and democratic values. The contrast with Trump's increasingly isolated position couldn't be starker. While he wages trade wars against allies and enemies alike, Canada and Mexico are building new partnerships and strengthening existing ones. China, despite its own tensions with both countries, has expressed readiness to improve relations with Canada. Australia, the United Kingdom, and other traditional allies are all signaling support for the new Canadian government's approach. What's particularly damaging for Trump is that his tariff strategy has united two countries that had been growing apart. Mexico had been increasingly frustrated with Canadian criticism of its trade ties with China. Some Canadian politicians had indeed floated the idea of excluding Mexico from future trade arrangements. Ontario Premier Doug Ford had called comparisons between Canada and Mexico the most insulting thing I have ever heard. But Trump's blanket tariffs on both countries created a common enemy and a shared interest in resistance. Suddenly, the differences between Canada and Mexico seemed far less important than their mutual need to stand up to American economic aggression. Trump had inadvertently become the glue that bound his two neighbors together in opposition to his policies. The economic data tells the story of Trump's miscalculation. While trade accounts for only 24% of U.S. GDP, it represents 67% of Canada's economy and 73% of Mexico's. This should have given Trump tremendous leverage, but only if he had used it wisely. Instead, his ham-fisted approach has motivated both countries to reduce their dependence on American markets as quickly as possible. Both Carney and Sheinbaum have been clear that they're not seeking confrontation for its own sake. They've repeatedly expressed willingness to negotiate and find mutually beneficial solutions. But they've also made it clear that they won't be bullied or coerced. Carney has said he's willing to meet with Trump, but only if the American president shows respect for Canadian sovereignty and is prepared for a comprehensive approach to trade negotiations. Trump's response has been predictably counterproductive. Rather than recognizing that his initial approach had failed and adjusting his strategy, he's doubled down on threats and bluster. He's extended deadlines for additional tariffs multiple times, creating uncertainty and economic disruption without achieving any of his stated objectives. Each delay makes him look weaker and more desperate, while giving his opponents more time to organize their resistance. The Canada-Mexico meeting in Mexico City was just the beginning. Both leaders announced plans for regular consultations and coordinated approaches to future trade negotiations. They're building institutional frameworks for cooperation that will outlast any individual political leader or administration. This isn't just a tactical response to Trump's current policies, it's a strategic realignment that could reshape North American economics for decades. For American businesses, this represents a nightmare scenario. Companies that have spent decades building integrated supply chains across North America now face the prospect of being cut out of new trade arrangements between their neighbors. The uncertainty created by Trump's erratic policies is already forcing businesses to make expensive adjustments and seek alternative suppliers and markets. The broader implications extend far beyond trade. Trump's approach has damaged America's reputation as a reliable partner and strengthened the hand of competitors like China. While the United States wages economic warfare against its closest allies, China is positioning itself as a stable alternative for countries seeking predictable trade relationships. This is exactly the opposite of what Trump promised when he launched his trade wars. He claimed that aggressive tactics would force other countries to give America better deals and restore American economic dominance. Instead, his policies are accelerating America's relative decline and pushing allies toward competitors and rivals. The timing couldn't be worse for Trump's broader agenda. With the USMCA review approaching in 2026, he needed Canada and Mexico to be divided and vulnerable. Instead, he's facing a united front that has had years to prepare for negotiations. Both countries have used the time since Trump's initial tariff threats to strengthen their economies, diversify their trade relationships, and build alternative supply chains. Perhaps most damaging of all, Trump's approach has revealed the fundamental weakness of his position. Despite all his bluster about American economic power, he's been unable to force either Canada or Mexico to capitulate to his demands. His repeated delays and extensions of tariff deadlines show that he knows his threats are damaging to American interests as well as foreign ones. The Canada-Mexico alliance represents more than just a response to Trump's current policies. It's a preview of what American foreign relations could look like if the United States continues to abandon the multilateral approach that made it a global superpower. Countries that have been loyal allies for decades are now actively planning for a future where America is less central to their economic and strategic calculations. These new partnerships are creating facts on the ground that will constrain future U.S. administrations.
The economic pressures we face, the impact that has on revenue because the economy is contracting. Why are you reflexively against a deficit that grows? Like, doesn't it add up?
Well, first of all, I think we should go back and understand what the Conservatives are generally going to do this session. That is hold Mark Carney to his own standard. So he wrote his campaign platform knowing that Trump's tariffs were in effect. He budgeted that out, and he committed in his platform a much lower deficit number than what they're now talking about. He committed to capping spending growth, even in the throne speech, which took place months after Trump became president and a full month after the election campaign. So I believe it's fair to hold Mark Carney to the promises on which he got elected. He went to the Canadian people, made a written promise to them, put it in writing in his platform, and I believe it's absolutely fair to hold him to that. Secondly, when the government has to borrow more money, when it's borrowing billions of money, that means it's gobbling up money out of the economy. They are now competing with everyone else who has to borrow money. They're going to compete with you when you renew your mortgage or when you get a mortgage, when you negotiate a line of credit, when businesses go out and try to borrow to invest in the economy. Now they have to compete with the government. So that puts massive pressure on interest rates. It also means taxes at some point, either through the hidden inflationary tax, which we already see inflation going up, or with outright tax hikes, which Liberals have also done in the past. So it's not just that we have this allergic reaction to deficits. There's deep economic principles that Conservatives fight for when we oppose massive increases in deficits.
The economic infrastructure being built between Canada and Mexico, the trade agreements being negotiated with other partners, and the supply chains being reorganized, all of these will persist long after Trump leaves office. Future American leaders will inherit a North America where the United States is no longer the undisputed economic center of gravity. Economic analysts are now warning that this could become the worst economic crisis of our time for North America.
The Prime Minister is busy, looking busy, flying around, grip and grin, pretending to do a lot while doing very little.
So what will the next budget tell us about Canada's spending habits? What might come from this brief trade mission to Mexico? I'm Rosemary Barton, here to break it down tonight. Chantal Hébert, Andrew Coyne, Althea Raj. Andrew, let's start with you. We've got a date now, perhaps a little bit later for the budget than we anticipated on Monday, pushing into November. But all those things that I mentioned there are factors that are making it difficult to come up with, I guess, that's what the government says, a budget for right now. What do you make of where they have landed on the date?
Well, it may also be because they're struggling to make the numbers add up. Look, the situation is deteriorating. This time, the last budget, which was 18 months ago, the budget for this year was supposed to be budget deficit for this year was supposed to be $39 billion. By the last spring Liberal platform, it was $62 billion. The C.D. Howe Institute in July said it's $92 billion, but the economy shrunk since then. It shrunk certainly 3 months in a row, maybe 6 months. So we could be looking at a number over $100 billion for all we know by this point. So we've had that message, that letter from the finance minister to his colleagues saying you've got to cut spending by 15% over 3 years, but then we find out that doesn't apply to about 2/3 of federal spending. When the C.D. Howe Institute looked at the numbers, they said that adds up to about a $22 billion cut over 3 years from a budget of over $500 billion. With a deficit of $100 billion, with all of the defense spending coming down the road in years to come, I don't think we're close to coming to grips with the fiscal situation. Prime Minister said the other day that they're still going to just achieve cuts in the federal payroll from attrition. I suspect that they're punting a bit. I think they're going to try to put off the really hard work until after the next election, if then.
But part of why Mark Carney is down in Mexico is not just, to make sure the relationship is...
The disruption to integrated supply chains, the collapse of decades-old trade relationships, and the uncertainty created by Trump's erratic policies are creating conditions for a regional recession that could spread globally. What started as Trump's attempt to extract better deals from his neighbors could end up triggering an economic catastrophe that damages all three countries. Trump's trade war strategy was supposed to demonstrate American strength and force concessions from weaker neighbors. Instead, it's created a powerful alliance between America's two largest trading partners, damaged relationships with key allies, and accelerated the very trends Trump claimed he wanted to reverse. The meeting between Carney and Sheinbaum isn't just bad news for Trump. It's a symbol of how his approach to international relations has backfired spectacularly. As both leaders made clear in their joint press conference, they're not seeking to exclude the United States from North American trade relationships, but they're also not going to allow American threats and bullying to determine their economic futures. For Trump, this represents a complete failure of his core foreign policy strategy. He came into office promising to use American economic power to force better deals from allies and competitors alike. Instead, he's watching those allies form new partnerships that explicitly exclude American influence and interests. The very countries he thought he could intimidate are now working together to limit his options and reduce their dependence on American markets. The Canada-Mexico meeting in Mexico City will be remembered as a turning point, the moment when Trump's trade war strategy finally collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. By trying to divide and conquer his neighbors, Trump succeeded only in uniting them against him. And that unity is now shaping the future of North American trade in ways that will constrain American power for years to come.